Because my brother is autistic, my entitled parents say he's allowed to act inappropriately toward me without any consequences. I am disgusted. Here is how it all went down. My parents, dad is 54 and my mom is 52, are angry with me for not ignoring my older brother's, 32, predatory behavior. Just a little context about my older brother and the situation at hand. My brother is 32 years old. He's never had a job. He dropped out of community college after 2 semesters for never doing his assignments. He's lived with my parents his entire life. He sleeps all day and stays up all night playing video games and watching porn. Both my brother and I, 27-year-old male, are diagnosed autistic and present our symptoms similarly, but I've been working since I was 17. Got my driver's license at 17, bought my first car at 24, and started college in 2019. My parents constantly use my brother's autism as an excuse for his appalling behavior, even though we're both on the spectrum. In November of 2020, I moved back in with my parents because I left an abusive relationship and had chronic health issues. I met my current girlfriend, 23-year-old female, in mid-2021, and in early 2022. She had some extenuating circumstances where my family agreed to let her live with us. My brother was immediately pleased with this development, but just as quickly behaved inappropriately. It started off with him creepily staring anytime my girlfriend and I kissed, progressed to him following my girlfriend into the bathroom anytime he saw her go in there for a shower, until he figured out she always locked the door because of him. And the straw that broke the camel's back was him trying to come into our bedroom uninvited and without knocking at 3 in the morning while we slept. Every time he behaved inappropriately, we mentioned it to my parents. But all that really happened were excuses made for him, because he's autistic, and brief conversation with him about not doing those things again, and then him still doing whatever he wanted. Anyway, after the bedroom incident, they kicked my girlfriend out, making her homeless for a brief period of time, because she had a PTSD panic attack since my brother made her feel unsafe. As a result of this, my girlfriend and I got an apartment together, and I moved out too, because I didn't want to be in the same house as my brother. I was upset with the way my girlfriend was treated, and I wasn't willing to break up with her, which my parents wanted me to do. I had a calm conversation with my parents explaining why I was moving out, where I explained it's their house, so they are more than entitled to make rules concerning their own home. However, I was not going to continue living somewhere my girlfriend wasn't welcome, and where my brother's predatory behavior was condoned. At first, they told me they love me. They're sorry they ever made me feel that way. They want me to keep a key to the house because I'm always welcome over, and that if I ever needed to move back in, I could. Several days later, I went over to pick up some more of my things, only to find that my parents had changed the locks on the door. Later that same week, they tell me they're angry with me for being ungrateful, saying I hate them and calling them bad parents, none of which I ever said. They went on to tell me that they didn't want to speak to me for a week because they were upset, needed time to process, and because they thought I needed to feel what it was like to be cut out of the family. I respected their wishes, and later my parents agreed to family therapy, which they quickly backed out of because they were only willing to do it over a 3-way video call, and my therapist website wasn't able to do that. I'm not sure why, but my therapist said it wasn't doable, at which point I told my parents I would be willing to attend family therapy with a therapist of their choice, who could do the 3-way video call, but that had yet to happen. That same Sunday, my parents invited me over for dinner, which I thought went well, only to find out they would continue to dodge my calls and leave my texts on read after that night. They eventually contacted me and told me to stop using their house as storage and pick up my things, despite requesting that I stay away for a week. My girlfriend and I go over to pick up the rest of our stuff, which was awkward but quick. Later that day, I got a text from my mom wishing me luck at college, but my parents still aren't willing to talk about the issues that led to me moving out, or even to come over to see our new apartment, after being invited over because, despite the circumstances, I still love them and want a relationship with them since this type of behavior is highly uncharacteristic of them. Understandably, my girlfriend isn't fond of them, but told me she doesn't mind me inviting my parents over because it's important to her that I have a relationship with my parents, for the sake of my mental well-being. Has anyone else ever dealt with a situation similar to this? If so, how did you deal with it? The original poster gave an update a couple days later. I've been working through some things in therapy, and I had a bit of an epiphany. For years, I thought my parents were doing me a favor by letting me live with them, but things started to unravel the more I thought about it and talked to my therapist. I'm currently 27, but I didn't start living on my own until I was 22, and always thought I was a failure or a late bloomer. But then I remembered I tried moving out on my own when I was 20. I found a friend who was willing to be my roommate at the time, and we were apartment hunting together. I eventually told my parents I wanted to move out, and my mom told me they wouldn't be willing to afford the rent for their apartment if I wasn't there to pitch in. And my dad asked me, "How are you going to find a roommate? You can't even find someone to hang out with on your birthday." When I lived with them, I didn't give them all my money from work, but I could never save more than $500 because they would inevitably fall behind on some bill, and I would have to help, and a lot of times I didn't have the money to help, so it was normal for me to sell my things at a pawn shop to pitch in, which was never asked of my older brother. I only had to stop contributing to my parents' finances once we were homeless in 2018, and reconnected with my extended family who let me couch surf, and they told my parents they thought it was weird I gave them so much money. When my parents lived in New York, I lived alone in Texas for 2 years. I was actually thriving, with the exception of my abusive ex and chronic health issues. I dropped 120 pounds. I was on the honor roll at my college. I bought a car. I was doing so well. Later, my mother admitted to me she was actually angry and resentful toward me for getting my first job at 17 because the government took away my disability money that she was managing. I feel like that's one reason my older brother is still treated as the golden child. He still gets disability that my mom manages 100% and is fairly obedient to her. It just made me think, wow, sorry I'm such a disappointment because I wasn't an obedient little disability check for you, and I wanted a life of my own. I was also sexually abused in first grade by a neighbor's teenage son, and when I asked my mom why she wasn't more protective of me, she said, "I was so concerned with making sure that never happened to your brother that it never occurred to me that it could happen to you." I used to think my parents were very moral and ethical people, but the more therapy I go to, the more I'm noticing patterns. For example, my mom was always doing research on narcissists and claiming that all my grandparents were narcissists, and that's why we want no contact with them for over a decade, which at the time when I was a kid, I believed her. But then I realized a classic narcissist tactic is to isolate people from others who can help them. I even remember being a freshman in high school and my mom terrifying me by convincing me my grandfather had hired private investigators to stalk us, which, knowing my grandfather now that I'm an adult, is something he'd never do. Sorry for the rant, but I needed to get this out somewhere. A few days later, the original poster gave another update. My parents have been very low contact because they're salty I didn't dump my girlfriend and excuse my brother's creepy behavior. During this whole situation, my grandfather has been nothing short of a rock for me. He and my step-grandmother have been offering me advice, help me get career counseling services, wants to help with my tuition now that I'm back in college, and have offered to buy plane tickets for both my girlfriend and I to fly cross-country to spend Thanksgiving with them, and get the opportunity to introduce my girlfriend to them. He's been very clear that he sides with me on the disagreement with my parents, because he doesn't agree with my brother's behavior, and has stated the obvious, that my parents don't seem to grasp that I'm a grown man and can date who I want and live my life as I see fit. I feel really lucky to have him around, but at the same time, I'm still incredibly frustrated with my parents. I have a large extended family, and I've heard through the grapevine that my parents want me to move back with them, but on their terms. And they're going low contact with me to teach me a lesson. And all I can think is, WTF kind of delusional fairy tale world do they live in where I would abandon a healthy relationship with my girlfriend and having my own place to moving back in with them just to be the scapegoat for all of my brother's BS. I'm sorry you've been through all of that. I hope your parents will come around soon. That's awful what your brother did to you. You should have called the police. It sounds like you've been doing a good job of taking care of yourself and focusing on your own goals, though. I can't believe how well your grandfather has supported you through this whole thing. That's really cool that he wants to meet your girlfriend and help with your tuition. Good for him. My 6-year-old sister burned the house down while I was babysitting her, and my entitled parents tried to make it my fault. I was 9 at the time. Here's how it went down. When my sister was 6, she set the backyard on fire. Evil Mamabear blamed me when she was at fault. At the time, I was more or less babysitting my sister while my parents were at work. But why they thought it was a good idea to have a 9-year-old babysit a 6-year-old is beyond me. It's one of the few things I did hold against my dad when I realized later how bad of an idea it was. But we were instructed to stay indoors while my parents were at work. My sister, being the hyperactive brat she was, loved to screw with me. If I even so much as put her in timeout, she'd tell our mother, EMB. And then, EMB would try and punish me for it. I set up my sister to play video games in the den, and just went to the living room for a while to play my Game Boy Color, and be left alone. I left the Game Boy's volume low just so I could keep an ear out. Things seemed fine. but after a few minutes, my sister ran into the room and started jumping up and down on the couch like it was a trampoline. I told her to stop, but she blew me a raspberry. Big mistake while jumping, and she bit her tongue. Then started crying that I'd hurt her and ran to her room sobbing. I called my dad to let him know what had happened. He groaned and said it wasn't my fault, and he'd deal with EMB later if she blamed me for it. Well, EMB did blame me for it. My sister had really hurt her tongue or something because she was talking with a lisp for days. EMB was ready to ground me, so I called Dad and put him on the phone with her, and together we explained it wasn't my fault. I told her to stop jumping on the couch, and she kept doing it anyway, so she did it to herself. EMB was furious and told me to just get out of her sight, and I did. Making myself scarce had become a talent at that point. Fast forward to late summer, the driest time of the year. I was doing my usual routine of making sure my sister was situated entertaining herself, then went to another room to play my Game Boy. I noticed after a while things seemed too quiet, so I got up to check on Sis when she suddenly came running in through the back door, screaming and crying to me on broken English from her tongue lisp that she'd goofed up. The moment she mustered out the word fire, I was running outside. A whole patch of dry grass and a part of the back fence were on fire. I got the hose and sprayed it down until it was all out. The fence was a little scorched, but otherwise okay. And none of the neighbors were home, so they didn't see. When I was confident the area was sufficiently soaked, I looked around and found a soggy box of Easy Light matches on the ground near my dad's barbecue. The lid was also off the barbecue. I picked up the matches and went back inside to ask my sister what she'd done, but didn't want to tell me. But I made her spit it out. She was playing with the matches over Dad's barbecue, but lit one too fast and dropped it. Then it set the ground on fire, so she came and got me. I called Dad to tell him what happened, and he rushed home. He hugged us both and repeatedly asked if we were okay. I said I was, but my sister wouldn't stop crying. Dad then called EMB to tell her what happened, and when she later came home from work, she ran straight to me and looked like she was geared up to slap me. But with Dad right there near me, she instead just started yelling at me. She was saying that it was all my fault, and that I should have been watching my sister constantly. Well, Dad didn't stand for that. Then he started grilling EMB over the fact that she had left the matches on the counter, because she'd used them for scented candles. Yeah, that's right, she left them out, and that's how Sis got them. My parents ended up arguing because EMB wanted to punish me for what happened, but my dad refused to let her, and even called her out on the fact that she just leaves Sis in another room and barely checks on her when she's home, and watching her as well. So EMB said we needed to go back to using a babysitter for a while. Dad agreed to that, and that's how we got Mindy, the teenage girl who babysat us for roughly a year. She was nice and pretty much my first crush, too. But she eventually left because EMB drove her nuts trying to micromanage everything over the phone. Dad made sure after that anything like matches and lighters were on lockdown in a place my sister couldn't get at them. So, as far as I know, Sis never got to play with matches like that again. Not long after the incident, my dad and I repainted the fence and spread some grass seed around the yard, so the whole incident was forgotten pretty quickly. I'm not even sure the neighbors noticed because the fire didn't make it to their side of the fence, and they'd have to look over a 6-foot fence into our yard to see. EMB still held to the belief it was all my fault for some time, though, and tried to say that to anyone who'd listen. I had to correct her for years that she was the one who left the matches out, and tried to pin everything on me as soon as she got home. I would also mention the near slapping. I had my story so down pat that I'd turn into a motor mouth until it was all stated out loud. The fact I had to have a memorized speech about it tells you how prepared I was dealing with EMB. Even back then, I corrected her once in public when she was gossiping with some other women at a party, and she nearly went off on me and covered my mouth. After that scene, I don't think those women spoke to her ever again. Eventually, she stopped bringing up the story and just focused on other things she blamed me for. I'm sorry you had to go through all that. Original poster, I've been in a similar situation, and I don't think there's any way to deal with it without losing some friends. Karen called the cops on me for buying the last PS5. I had gone to the local Bullseye looking to pick up a few things with my cousin, Tom, for a long night of gaming, as neither of us had anything to do that Friday or Saturday night, and the then new COD Vanguard had just released. Not knowing how terrible this game was, we were hyped to get in as many hours as we could. As I carry my basket with balls, Doritos, and the biggest bag of pizza rolls I've ever seen, I happened to notice a singular PS5 sitting behind the glass in electronics. Walking up to Tom, I asked if he was planning on getting it, and he wasn't interested. He already has the new Xbox, so that's fair. I send Tom to fetch an employee so I can collect my overpriced prize. Looking forward to those PS exclusives over the coming months. Everything goes swimmingly, and I've bought the PS5. No sooner than I grab the bag and pick it up, a woman approaches. We'll name her Susan, as she wasn't good enough at her craft to be dubbed Karen. Susan interjects the closing niceties between myself and the store clerk with a panicked, "Excuse me?" The three of us turn, and the store employee asks if he can help. Susan says no. That will not be needed, as she's looking to chat with me. I make sure she's aware I am not a member of the Bullseye staff. Susan confirms she knows this, as her voice continues to feign sweetness. Susan says, "I see you have the last PS5 they have in stock. Were you going to buy that?" To which I responded, "Actually, I already did. I'm stoked to finally have one." Susan replies, "No, no, no! You can't have it! I need it! I'll pay you double what you paid for it!" Now look, if I hadn't just spent ages trying to track one of these new systems down, I'd have just sold it to her at cost. But I wasn't able to find an RTX 3080, Xbox Series, or PS5 at this point, so no amount of money could have convinced me to part with it. I informed Susan, and she is absolutely not having it. All the feigned sweetness instantly gone. She demands I give her the PS5. Store employee interjects, telling Susan if she continues to harass customers, he will have to ask her to leave. Susan turns and says, "I don't care what you say, I'm going to get that PlayStation!" However, I did use this moment to slip Susan and make a break for the exit. Reaching my car, and just as we were pulling out of the space, we spot Susan running. Thinking nothing of it, I drop it into drive and putter to the exit. About a mile to a mile and a half after leaving Bullseye, I hear frantic honking from behind and look up. If you guessed, I saw Susan in her BMW SUV tailgating and swerving all over the highway, you'd be correct. Other than laughing with Tom, I ignored her entirely. Roughly 10 minutes pass, and she's still right there on my ass when I hear sirens and notice the telltale cherries and berries of a state police cruiser directly behind Susan. Rejoice. However, Susan pulls to the right lane, and the officer continues on. Now, he is directly on my bumper, and he's laying on the air horn being super obnoxious. So I pull over, and yep, he's there for me. Susan had also pulled over behind the officer, though I hadn't noticed. The officer approached me and treated me like a possible DUI, and explained they had received a call about my vehicle swerving all over the road and driving at erratic speeds. After a couple of back and forths, he was convinced everything was fine and started to tell me to have a nice day, when Susan out of nowhere screams, "Officer, arrest this man! He stole my PS5! I explained to the officer that I had bought the PS5 at Bullseye, and what had happened with Susan. The officer was extremely confused, but could see the PS5 sitting on the back seat within the car. He asked if I could prove that it was mine and that I did in fact pay for it, to which Susan said, "Absolutely not! He knows I bought it, and he grabbed it in the parking lot! Thank God you're here, officer!" So, having worked retail many years ago, I knew that my card number would be on the receipt. So I opened with, "Well, I also have the receipt, if that helps." Which Susan, the dim-witted bird she was, immediately jumped on stating that I had stolen that out of her hands too. This is where I proudly exclaimed that all receipts show the last 4 digits of the card used to purchase things, as well as the first initial and last name of the card holder. Susan continued to state, "Yeah, and my name is on it!" I pulled my driver's license, bank card, and receipt out, handing them to the officer. Everything matched. The officer hands them back, thanking me, and immediately turns to Susan, who is now screaming, "Well, aren't you going to arrest him for being drunk? He was all over the road!" Officer replies, "So you're the one who called us about a possible DUI?" Susan proudly exclaimed, "Yes, now arrest him!" The officer immediately pulled out his handcuffs and slapped them on Susan as she, with a voice full of fear, asked what the hell he was doing. Officer explained that Susan was under arrest for making a false report, misuse of 911, and my state's law on stalking. Now, while I got this wonderful PS5, Susan got her car towed, the full weekend in lockup, and when the dust finally settled, she pled guilty to making a false police report and harassment. I don't know what the terms were, but she was put on a 2-year probation and banned from the local Bullseye until it was completed. You're a lucky guy, dude. I mean, it's pretty crazy that you had someone attempt to steal your PS5 and then manage to get them in cuffs without actually contacting the police yourself. I'm really glad you got some officers that did their job properly and checked everything out, then on top of that, did the right thing by not going easy on Susan, as she needs to be taught a lesson. Enjoy your time on the PS5. I'm sure it wasn't easy for you to secure it.